Hello, everybody. So in Module 6, we're going to be going into the features of autism. I do have to warn you, this is a bit of a lengthy module. We're going to be covering a lot of different chapters. However, that being said, it really is one of the more interesting of the modules that we're going to be covering in this class. And I've heard from a lot of students in the past at the end of the semester that have said this is actually one of their favorite modules because it actually goes into not overly technical information, but rather more usable information that's more applicable. So that's one of the reasons that they give for preferring it. So as I mentioned, this is one of the lengthier modules we're going to be going over. And you see that laid out here on the PowerPoint slide. There are a total of 8 different chapters that we're going to be covering. The first one you see on here, the autism at the behavioral level, is going to be the only one that's from a different book. So that's from the Fletcher, Watson, and Happ book. The other 7 are all going to be from the same one, which is Henderson and colleagues. And again, I'm kind of hesitant. That looks like a lot to go over. These are smaller chapters, and I would say, especially with the Henderson and colleagues text, it's laid out in a really easy to follow way. A lot of each of these chapters is actually laid out where it's sort of like questions, common misconceptions. They talk a lot in that text also about gender differences, cultural differences, things like that. So it's a really interesting book. Of course, I hope all my students, read all of the text that I provide. But I kind of know as a teacher who's been doing this for a while, that isn't always the case. My suggestion is try to read as much of the Henderson text as you can, because I think you'll find it pretty interesting. So the way that this lecture is going to be laid out is going to be where I go down the list of each of those chapters. So we're going to start with the Fletcher, Watson, and Happ text. And this chapter really lays out kind of an overview of autism and autistic behaviors, and then I go into more specific detail about each of those behaviors as we go through the lecture. In keeping with that topic of looking at kind of the broader, more introductory portion of kind of like how behavior is assessed in autism spectrum disorder, it's worth noting that diagnosis of ASD is based on behavior. And that's kind of a default, right? We don't necessarily know the etiology, the cause of autism spectrum disorder. In fact, we don't think there is just a cause. There's probably multiple causes. But this isn't a disorder like diabetes or hypothyroidism or something like that, where you can just go get a blood test and you can find that biomarker, as it says on the slide, to make that diagnosis. So the way we have to do it is off of objective observance of behavior by people who are experienced to do that. Assessments, there are some pretty sound, valid assessments, but even those are based on behavior. So behavior, understanding behavior is important not just for making the diagnosis, but also for understanding the disorder as somebody who may deal with it yourself, as somebody who may work with colleagues, coworkers, those who may be like myself, teaching individuals that may have it, just having the better understanding. It's worth us giving that little bit of extra effort in understanding the behavioral component of ASD. Even though I did talk about this in past modules, there are quite a bit of challenges that are posed with making diagnoses in this way. And I'm going to go into them in this slide as well as the next slide. So the first part is that really when we look at it, and historically, the criteria that was being applied was really developed with strong cultural influences. If you remember going back to Connor and to Asperger, those men were in the United States. Asperger was in Germany, or Austria rather. Um, very strongly influenced by those cultures of those countries. And really, what happened is what developed was a diagnostic criteria that was largely a result of those cultures then being applied to people from different cultures. And that doesn't always work well. Um, Likewise, one of the big issues that we have today is that ASD tends to be a concern, an issue, a challenge in developed countries. And oftentimes, people who look at less developed countries, they kind of mistakenly present that as, well, there's no autism there. Well, there is. It's just people aren't qualified in recognizing it. So it isn't really at the forefront of public health. There is one thing that's kind of interesting, and this is another thing that's often cited as being within that same vein of thought, which is that when you look back historically, the rate of autism was very, very, very low. Even Conner and Asperger themselves said this was a very rare condition. However, current estimates is that it says here 1%, some go as far as 1 in 40 something children today in the United States are diagnosed with ASD at some point in their life. This kind of goes back to what I just mentioned, though, right? The more aware people are, the more developed healthcare systems are. To be frankly honest, even the more healthcare systems don't have to focus on more pressing life-ending challenges, like in sub-Saharan Africa, where there are countries that are absolutely being decimated by the HIV epidemic. That's going to take the forefront. So things like ASD awareness probably isn't going to be at the forefront of those public health systems because they have limited resources. They have to devote it to certain areas. In the US, we don't have that challenge. Many developed countries, we don't have those challenges, thankfully. And also, we've had a high rate of being able to diagnose, to treat, assessment. There's plenty of professionals that are trained to do just that. So the net effect of that is recently, you see this big upturn in the rate for ASD diagnosis. One of the other important things to remember is that the criteria itself has shifted over time. If you go back in the earlier modules where I talk about diagnosis of ASD, I talked about this, that based on different editions of the DSM, the actual criteria has shifted in some cases quite considerably over the decades. That criteria has now become a lot more expansive and inclusive of a wide range of conditions that in the past would not have qualified as autism, but today does. So that alone kind of also helps explain this expansion of ASD diagnosis, at least in the United States. And of course, greater public awareness. ASD really kind of benefits and is also challenged by it being a very well-known disorder. I say it benefits from it because ASD research is one of the most well-funded areas of research in the United States. Challenged because the more people are interested in a topic, the more misinformation is available also. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there. And of course, some of these other things, we've talked about before, possible gender biases. We'll talk about that again in the semester. Also, some of the issues with diagnosis as far as assessment tools. The assessment tools we have now are a lot better than they used to be, but is there room for improvement? Of course, there's always room for improvement. One area that is kind of important to note is where it comes to aspects of sensory dysfunction or atypical experience of sensory stimuli. Now, oftentimes this is really tightly connected with autism spectrum disorder, but it's worth noting sensory differences are not part of the actual diagnostic criteria. Are they very common in individuals with ASD? Yes, but they're not necessarily required to be present, and not everybody with ASD has sensory disruptions or atypical manifestations of sensory experiences. I'll talk about that a little bit in greater detail towards the end of the lecture today. And it says on here synesthesia. I'll talk about that actually right at the end of the lecture today. It's a very interesting topic of this connection between sensory disruptions and ASD. One thing that I want you to keep in mind as I go through the lecture today is this concept of the autism constellation model. So this is a model that represents the diversity of autism, or the idea that autistic traits are like a constellation of stars. So this is a little kind of cerebral, a little philosophical, but just think about how diverse autism is. And oftentimes when we look at diagnostic criteria or behaviors, we kind of look at it in a polarized way, right? Either they're present or they're not. It's a yes or it's a no. That's not the case with autism. And at this point in the semester, I'm sure you're probably painfully aware of this. Things aren't that neat and tidy. So, as we go through the different aspects of the features of autism in this lecture, keep in mind this idea of this constellation model. So, it's not just if something's present or if it isn't, but the degree and to the extent at which it's present and it impacts or affects the individual. So, an example of that here is with communication, right? That's a key part of autism is impacts in some way of communication. Well, that's a wide range, right? That's not just is it impactful or is it not impactful? Is it present or is it not? There are people with ASD who are completely nonverbal, non-communicative in any way. There are some who engage in echolalia, where they'll kind of repeat different terms over and over and over again. We'll talk about that in greater detail later in the lecture. Um, there are people who are completely typical as far as their ability to communicate. And in fact, some with ASD that may be polyglots. They may speak many, many different foreign languages, like to a really impressive level. I've seen some people that are fluent in 10, 11, 12 languages, but yet they still have issues with communication in that, they may engage in repetitive statements, or they may have kind of what we consider sort of like atypical speech patterns, or where their emotions may be disconnected. So there's no tone or intonation in their speech, right? So that's a wide range of different things. So that's what we're talking about with this constellation model, right? It's not just if something's present or is it if it isn't, but the degree, the extent to which that present issue, challenge is with the individual themselves. And you can say that about really everything, right? Everything we're going to talk about today, talking about the features, really can come down to this type of a way of visualizing it with this constellation model. That model, incidentally, is kind of a new creation in our studies of ASD. If you recall, when I talked a little bit about the history of ASD, and indeed when I talked about diagnosis, I talked more about what's called the fraction triad. So this was the idea early on of trying to come up with a framework really for making a diagnosis. And really what this fracture triad was that the three main components of ASD were social communication dysfunctions, is really the way they worded it, restricted or repetitive behaviors, and then sensory differences. Now, the sensory part isn't really a part of the diagnostic criteria now, but it was historically. And again, many people do associate it with ASD. The idea though with the fractured triad was more polar, right? Either it was present, it wasn't present. So remember, that's not really the most inclusive kind of model that we use now. That is what the constellation model has really largely replaced. Now, what's interesting about this is that the implications of it is that it provides more individualized support and treatment for those individuals who have ASD, right? Because it's not one size fits all. It's not, the same person who's nonverbal is going to get the same treatment as somebody who is completely fluent and verbal and maybe even knows several different foreign languages, but still has some issues with communication. Uh, but there's a downside. It doesn't make it a lot more difficult to do research and to study in ASD because you kind of have to really, you know, compare apples to apples, not apples to oranges. So the available population you pull from kind of becomes smaller and smaller the more categorized they become. As I go through the lecture today at various stages, I will talk about more specific gender differences. But generally speaking, at this point, historically in ASD research, diagnosis, treatment, there has been more of a strong male bias. We do think that males may be a little bit more, have a higher prevalence rate of ASD, but historically it was very skewed. It was 90-95% males that were being diagnosed. There's a variety of different reasons behind this. Some of it is just that we believe with males, um, ASD may just manifest more. We'll talk about masking later in the lecture today. Some ideas are that women and girls are just better because of cultural pressure at masking and hiding their symptoms, not necessarily intentionally but unintentionally. It also may just be a reflection of overall systemic gender bias in our society that males may just get more focus and attention than females do historically. This is changing though now. I wouldn't say it's perfect yet, but there definitely has been quite a change in that breakdown. Like I said, historically, it's 95% males that were diagnosed with ASD. That has come down quite a bit to where it's more parity between the two genders. And that does trickle down into a lot of different things like clinical practice, research, treatments. And of course, one of the big growing areas, which we'll talk about later in the semester, is also with overrepresentation of individuals that are ASD in the LGBTQ plus community. And this is kind of in particular relevant because many of them do identify, especially the trans community, as non-binary. So that has been more of a focus of research as well. Another area of research that has really come along quite a bit recently is this focus of autism not just as being a disorder of childhood, but as being a lifelong disorder. And that may sound kind of common sense, but in a lot of developmental disorders, the focus is primarily on children because the idea is earlier identification, earlier intervention leads to long term better outcomes. That being said, though, obviously ASD is not in and of itself a fatal disorder. And what we're seeing is this huge explosion of children being diagnosed with ASD really started about the 1980s, 1990s. So now we're seeing where these kids at that time are now adults. We are seeing where some are starting to go into middle adulthood. And there's certainly implications of things like, well, what kind of resources are needed as these people age throughout the lifespan. And in particular, one big area of research now is for elder care. If you just think about that, and a lot of research, not just elder care, elder resources for individuals who have ASD, but also are there particular connections between ASD and things like dementia, Parkinson's? I've seen studies done on multiple different types of disorders trying to see if there may be some connection, especially neurological, cognitive types of disorders, memory disorders. There's a lot of research being done on that. One area that has definitely shifted within the studies of autism spectrum disorder and in research in ASD is more of a focus and appreciation for the societal slash cultural components of ASD. And this is really multifaceted. Um, Indeed, one of the big takeaways I hope all my students get from my class is this idea that there is a growing movement within the ASD community to kind of embrace the idea of neurodivergence, that ASD for them isn't a disorder. This isn't something to be ashamed of. This isn't something that you should, feel bad about, but rather embrace. And that's a huge shift because really historically, and I would say even still to this day with some people, those diagnostic labels of being told you have autism historically has been kind of a bad thing. It's been something that's actually led to worse outcomes for people. So I think in some ways embracing it can really be a powerful experience for a lot of people. It is worth noting, though, and I always like to throw this out, that is more so the case for those individuals who are higher functioning rather than lower functioning with various aspects of ASD. And other than in those areas, this idea and embracing this idea has kind of helped break down what has historically been known as the deficit model, right? So it's kind of categorizing those with ASD, not holistically of their strengths, their weaknesses, but just focusing on what they can't do. Which is really kind of a really derogatory way of viewing anybody with any kind of disorder or disability. Looking at somebody in a wheelchair and saying, well, all the things they can't do because they're in a wheelchair kind of negates everything they are able to do by overcoming that. And that's the same thing for ASD. One really big important term that I want you to know is this idea of double empathy problem. So this is a theory. This isn't anything that's proven. It's a social cultural theory, but it suggests that communication breakdowns between autistic and non-autistic people are a two-way issue. It's reciprocal, where both parties struggle to understand each other due to differences in communication styles and experiences, meaning neither side can fully empathize with the other, creating mutual misunderstanding. This concept has been in particular embraced by those who kind of embrace the idea of neurodivergence. And it's not so much trying to understand somebody or trying to force somebody who has autism spectrum disorder to quote unquote be normal or view things in a typical way, but rather just to embrace those differences. Because in the past, what's happened is that we've kind of viewed it through this idea of if I'm neurotypical and you're not, then you need to adjust to fit into my world. And what ends up happening is a lot of conflict and tension leads to misunderstandings, and it leads to really a lot of judgment and kind of negative stereotypes as a result of that. All right, so that's the end of the general aspect of the lecture. Now I'm going to go into specific features of autism spectrum disorder, and I'm going to start exploring that Henderson and colleagues text that I mentioned earlier. One of the first big features we're going to explore is this concept of reciprocity and the role that it plays in social interactions. So, reciprocity are intuitive, everyday social exchanges. Most people kind of take these for granted because there's something that has developed within you over the course of years and years and years throughout your childhood. And they're oftentimes not things that are explicitly stated. These are things like everyday greetings, knowing how to take turns in conversation, sharing experiences, oftentimes little social kind of customs that we develop and that we learn. Sometimes when it comes to reciprocity, really it's sort of that way of interacting with somebody so that they feel comfortable, and then they make you feel comfortable in return. So remember, it's this reciprocal type of relationship. So there's actually a lot of different kind of individual parts of this reciprocity. One of the big ones is sort of a thing that you probably don't recognize, but there's this intuition that many people have, especially those who don't have ASD, behind social behaviors. And this is oftentimes kind of like greetings or responses, sort of like rituals that we develop. So a good example of that is something like in the United States, most parts of the United States, if you pass by somebody and you want to have a greeting, you can say hi, say good morning. But a lot of times what we do is we say, hey, how you doing? Right? And the other person says, good, how are you? Oh, I'm doing good. Thanks for asking. And that's it. Right? It's a greeting, despite saying, how are you doing? Most of the time when somebody asks that, they really don't want to know. It's just a way of being polite. Something like that, and that nuance may be difficult for some individuals with ASD, right? They may actually answer it literally. They may say, well, I don't know. It's kind of difficult for me to say. I'm really nervous today and I'm kind of stressed out. And I'm wondering why you're asking me how I'm doing since I don't know you. Right. And you can see where a person asking that and getting that response would be like, what? It's something that can be really difficult. And that's why I say oftentimes people who are neurotypical, that's something you probably don't even really think of. It's almost reflexive. Um, there's a lot of these unspoken kind of rules or expectations. A lot of them come from social norms, social customs. And whenever I talk about things like social norms, I like to use this as an example. And it kind of highlights how oftentimes these things develop without you actually like actively learning them. It's something you passively learn just from being a kid and watching how people interact. So the example is you on an elevator, right? Now, chances are nobody at any point in your life, your mom, your dad, grandparents, caregivers, didn't tell you literally how you should act on an elevator. What happens is you just kind of learn from watching other people. And if you did something kind of out of line, they're probably going to be treated different. So, for example, if I walk into an elevator and I walk right in and it's crowded, there's a bunch of people, I stand right at the doorway and I face the people. I don't turn around and look at the door. I face all the people waiting in the elevator and I just put my arms to my side and I stare at them, right? They're going to treat me really weird. They're going to think that I am weird, I'm odd, I'm bizarre, and I am going to pick up on that through body language that will probably let me know I'm doing something wrong. I need to change it. Nobody may even tell me any of that, right? These are all unspoken rules and expectations. But imagine if those are things that you have a difficult time with, how people would treat you, and then how you would pick up and react to that, right? So that's this really interesting part of how ASD and society and that social cultural component really kind of interact with one another. It's very interesting, and it's very difficult sometimes for those people who are neurotypical to really kind of comprehend and get that by, because to them these are things that are just very reflexive. So it's really kind of an important part, especially when we talk about this concept of reciprocity. So when we talk about ASD and one of the big features of it within social settings, we're really talking about some major challenges here, right? Oftentimes, some people, not all people with ASD, may have difficulty reading those social cues, especially those kind of unspoken social norms that we just kind of take for granted. Oftentimes, that reciprocity can be a struggle with them, understanding to take turns and to kind of keep a conversation flowing by asking questions of the other person, not just talking about yourself. Oftentimes, too, there can be misunderstandings of other people's intentions. And indeed, that in particular can kind of lead to some problems later on, because nuances of conversation, like tone of voice, that can kind of hint of being like passive aggressive or sarcastic, may not be picked up by some people with ASD. They may be taking literal, right? So they may take something like, "Oh my God, please keep talking about yourself. I find this so interesting," as being a literal like encouragement for them to keep talking, right? Whereas other people who may be more neurotypical in that manner will pick up on that as being sarcasm. Oftentimes, also, what you'll see is that those with ASD, some people with ASD, may kind of overuse a single type of interaction style. In a lot of cases, that may be where they just stick to being like more formal or overly polite. They may not delve into things like being more kind of informal or joking around or anything like that, because it's just really difficult. And oftentimes what I've seen is that, they kind of go with what works for them. So in the past, what's worked for them is maybe being polite. They're going to be really polite to everybody from there on out. And again, that's not everybody, but it is a common feature with ASD. Some specific areas where oftentimes, especially children and adolescents, do have some difficulty, and that a lot of times, counselors, therapists, clinicians spend a lot of time initially working with them on, are things like greeting, responding, kind of the normal little pleasantries that we oftentimes use throughout the day, sharing personal experiences, and then managing that back and forth. So, not monopolizing the conversation, not going on and on about a very specific topic that the other person may not care about, but sharing a little bit about yourself, but then waiting for the other person to kind of respond and read that situation, and then you in turn responding. Those are areas, very specific areas, that many individuals with ASD do have problems with. Now, that being said, there's a lot of misconceptions about ASD, especially when it comes to socialization. Those individuals who have problems with social interactions don't lack empathy, and they're not disinterested in you, right? So they're not talking about themselves nonstop and not asking about you because they're not interested in you or they don't care about you. I've even heard some people kind of hint that it's a form of narcissism. Well, it isn't. With ASD, it's an inability to really comprehend that part. With somebody with narcissism, I don't want to say it's a choice, but it's really more of a active, conscious process with them. Somebody with ASD, it isn't. It's worth noting at this point, though, if you kind of start thinking about it, how really severely impacted could it be if just simple greetings, having a normal conversation with somebody is that complicated? Just think for a second, especially if you're somebody who happens to be neurotypical, how big of an impact would that be? Right? That'd probably be a pretty big impact in your life. So, what ends up happening is a really kind of interesting feature that many people develop that have ASD is this concept of camouflaging. So, what camouflaging refers to is changing one's external presentation in order to blend into your surroundings. Uh, in some ways you can kind of think of it as like trying to fit in, right? Or putting on a mask that you think helps you to better blend in or fit in. In many ways, it's kind of an attempt to pass as non autistic or to look quote unquote normal. And of course, that's a really loaded term, right? What we use is typical, atypical. But oftentimes, I know when I've talked to kids, especially and adults, that use camouflaging, that's kind of what they say is, I just want to look normal. I want to act normal. Um, it's worth noting, though, that makes it sound sort of like it's an intentional thing. And oftentimes, what happens is that this camouflaging develops uh, kind of organically, naturally throughout a kid's life. Adults, oftentimes, especially if they haven't been diagnosed as children, are so good at this that they don't even recognize that they're doing it, right? So it's not necessarily a voluntary, intentional thing. It's really much more of an involuntary, unintentional thing. They kind of have to develop this camouflaging to fit in. An example of it, right, going back to something like in the elevator, living in a world where you're constantly being made to feel like you're different, you're weird, you're odd, you're going to try everything possible to just try to blend into that world, even if you don't entirely. Now, that term camouflaging has different terms also. Sometimes you hear code switching, but the one I hear the most, I would say this is probably used more often than camouflaging, is masking. And I think that's a really good term to apply to this because it's kind of what you're doing. You're kind of putting on a mask to present an image to the world that you think they want to see. That's a really, really common feature with individuals that have ASD. In fact, very common. Although this camouflaging or masking happens kind of organically and oftentimes is involuntary and something that's not intentional, it does have some effects, some consequences. The first one is that it does kind of put additional stress on a person. I mean, just think for a second if you had to feel like you have to change who you are, not just for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, a day, but day after day throughout your life to the point that it almost feels second nature to you to do it, that you're not even thinking about it. That's got to be really exhausting. And another way where it's really unfortunate is that, it's really society's problem with people who are neurodivergent that's causing this. And in the process, it's causing that person to also be ashamed or lose track of who they are, their own sense of personal identity. And of course, once you start going on that path, it can lead to a lot of far reaching problems, things with self esteem, self confidence. And then those are oftentimes foundational for major mental health disorders, things like major depressive disorder, anxiety disorders. So oftentimes, from a clinician standpoint, we look at this in children as a way of trying to develop other types of coping skills besides masking. For adults, oftentimes we kind of look at ways for them to recognize it because oftentimes at that point they don't even recognize they're doing it, and then find different ways of handling those concerns that they have that would have led to them using the masking. So it's something that's really kind of important. On another note, oftentimes this masking or camouflaging, especially with adults, can make it difficult to actually diagnose because, and again, this isn't intentional, but they want to fit in, they want to belong, they don't want to feel like outcasts. So oftentimes they'll kind of give you the answers they think you want to hear. And again, it's not intentional, it's not necessarily voluntary, right? It's just something that happens, that develops because it's had to develop because of the social pressure that many of these people have experienced. So I mentioned earlier in the video that I'd talk about gender differences at various stages throughout the lecture. So here's my first time, right? When we talk about reciprocity, and especially also when we talk about that concept of masking, there is a big difference, generally speaking, between girls and boys, between men and women. Girls typically do better at mimicking social norms than do boys, and the same is true between women and men. There's a variety of different things that have been proposed as explaining this. The best theory, and it is a theory, it's not proven, is that just culturally that females experience stronger cultural pressures generally than do males. In the United States, I would say, this is up for debate, but my experience as a male is that I don't think that males are necessarily as uh, pressured to necessarily kind of fit in, go along as females are. For a male to be more kind of like independent, it's oftentimes viewed as being more desirable than it is for women historically, and that is a general statement, right? There's always going to be individual differences, but that's kind of the theory, and that's one of the things that kind of has shaped why girls and women may be better at doing the masking and kind of fitting in better with some of these aspects of social interactions when it comes to things like reciprocity. And again, this could be an issue also with why females historically have been underdiagnosed with ASD, because these social interactions and impairments is a big part of the diagnostic criteria. Now I'm going to move on into the next chapter of the Henderson text, which deals with nonverbal communication, what oftentimes we view as body language. As we explore this topic, I wanted to kind of talk about something I mentioned previously, which is that double empathy problem. So remember, the double empathy problem kind of says like two groups from two different cultures with different ways of experiencing the world, are probably going to be kind of at odds with one another. Basically, if I meet somebody from a different culture with different standards, I'm probably going to judge them based off of my cultural experience, and they're going to judge me based off their cultural experience. Now, the reason why cultures is in quotes is oftentimes we kind of understand that and maybe recognize it if it's something like a person from the United States versus the culture of Pakistan or Korea or sub-Saharan Africa, right? Countries that have quite different cultures. But culture can also exist within societies. Individuals who have ASD kind of do develop their own culture, their own standards. And when it comes to things like body language, nonverbal communication, these can be quite different. Going back to my analogy of people from different cultures, I don't think I'm a world traveler, but I've done my fair share of traveling around the world. And I can say I've been to some countries where gestures are taken quite different than they are in the United States. Some countries I've been to, given the old thumbs up sign, is actually really offensive. It's like giving somebody the middle finger. And hopefully nobody watching this comes from one of those cultures who are like, wow, Professor Fox is so rude. I've been to countries where, and these are very, very strict countries, conservative countries, where I was kind of shocked to see grown men holding hands walking down the street. I know in particular, I went to one very conservative country with my brother and his husband, and they were really worried about being gay in this country because they had very, very, very strict laws in place. It was actually a felony to be homosexual. And we walked through the city first day and we saw grown men walking around holding hands, and we're like, wait a second, this is weird. Not weird because it's happening, but it's just like that's not what we expected. Well, in that country, grown men holding hands was just a sign of friendship. There was nothing romantic there. In the United States, that'd be considered a sign of romantic involvement, right? I have many buddies. I'm a heterosexual man. I don't hold their hands walking down the street. So the reason why I'm saying all this is to give you an idea, right? Those are drastic differences. Well, even between typical and neurodivergent individuals within a country like the United States, you can still have these issues that come up. And to somebody who may be neurodivergent, neuroatypical, your body language, your ways of nonverbal communication, even though you come from the same society, if you're neurotypical, can be just as shocking, and vice versa. So these nonverbal cues are actually really important. Oftentimes you hear people say, body language is like 90% of communication. I don't think it's that much, but it is very, very, very important. And it's something that oftentimes we do very quickly without really putting much thought into it, interpreting a person's body language. So not just what they say verbally, but what they say with their body. Incidentally, that term nonverbal communication, it can be defined as the process of sending and receiving messages without using words. Now, that can be things like sign language, but really what we're talking about is like body language with this. So you see an example of some of the different components of nonverbal communication here. Things like body positioning and personal space. That's one that a lot of people don't really fully appreciate. Certain countries and certain people have a different requirement for how much space they kind of want between them and other people. Generally more highly developed, and what I mean by highly developed in this case is like densely developed areas, like say New York City, their need for personal space is oftentimes smaller than people from rural areas where they kind of want people to be a little bit more distant from them. Eastern Asian societies oftentimes have less need for personal space than people from Europe and North America, where we kind of want a lot. The United States, generally speaking, they've done studies on this. Most people kind of left to their own devices actually want a lot of space between them and other people. Being too close to somebody in those types of cultures is going to be taken as being really unnerving. I know for me, I like kind of having some distance. If somebody just comes up and they're like in my face, the first thing I'm doing is kind of taking a step back and moving away from them. Eye contact and gaze is a really important aspect of nonverbal communication. In some cultures, looking somebody in the eye is considered to be kind of offensive, especially if that person's in a position of authority. In the United States, I think we oftentimes kind of emphasize, maybe even overemphasize eye contact as being somebody's trustworthy if they look me in the eyes, talk to me straight in my eyes. It's worth noting though, even in the United States, some people, those with ASD in particular, those with things like social anxiety disorder, or even just individuals who don't have a disorder but are just shy, probably aren't going to look you in the eyes. And it's not a sign of disrespect. It's not a sign of untrustworthiness. It's just what they feel comfortable with. So that's a great element of nonverbal communication. Some vocal elements. So this isn't necessarily the words you're saying, but the tone. So like the volume of what you're saying. And indeed, sometimes people with ASD do have some issues with this, right? They may speak at a lower tone than what would be considered typical or a higher tone. The prosody, the rate of speech, if it's kind of sing-songing, these are all aspects that sometimes, again, aren't necessarily formally taught to you. We just pick up from interacting with people. If you talk too loud to somebody, they're going to kind of respond. You're able to pick up on those social cues and change the way you speak. Well, somebody with ASD may not be able to actually do that picking up of the social cue. And indeed, when we talk about nonverbal communication, it's not an island unto itself, right? All these different nonverbal cues I just talked about, as well as overall body language, actual speech, are multidimensional. So it's not just picking up on each of these individually, but then integrating all of them into a bigger meaning. So all of these are both receptive and expressive. So what I mean is receptive is you picking up on another person's nonverbal cues. Expressive is your ability to convey those nonverbal cues to somebody else. So if I'm being really animated, I'm talking to somebody and I'm slapping my hand like that, that means I'm emphatic or I'm really worked up or I'm angry or I'm frustrated. Well, if the other person isn't picking up on that in a receptive way, you can see where there could be miscommunications. So going into greater detail with each of these elements I just mentioned, body positioning and personal space. So one thing that we'll talk about towards the end of the lecture, we talk about senses, is proprioception. So proprioception is really awareness and orientation of your body position. Some people with ASD have an issue with this. It's something that can be really difficult for them. We don't necessarily know why. So things like body positioning and body spacing sometimes can be really difficult for them. Oftentimes what you see is that they may have kind of like awkward positioning. I'm kind of chuckling to myself here a little bit because it's almost like an inside joke within the ASD community of having a difficulty with sitting down properly to where you feel comfortable and where you feel appropriate. I know many clients that have done that where they'll be sitting down in my office and they're like never actually feel comfortable with the way they're sitting because they're just always aware of it and it feels awkward to them. And generally speaking, the more difficult the situation, so like a job interview, is probably going to lead to bigger issues with somebody who has this concern versus, them sitting down playing a video game or something like that. So as I mentioned before, eye contact in the United States, generally speaking, we expect the other person that we're talking to kind of look us in the eye, not necessarily like constantly staring at the person in the eyes, but a nice, pleasant kind of give and take of looking in the eyes, looking away. Oftentimes, though, what you see is that individuals with ASD can have some difficulty with this. Some of it is that they can become too hyper focused. Some of them do have issues with their visual sensory systems. That could be just an issue that they have of being hypersensitive or hyposensitive. Oftentimes, though, it's the social component with it that can be really quite difficult. Um, this is one of those areas, though, and it's gotten a little bit better, but historically was really kind of focused on as being something to change because historically in the United States, at least when I was a kid, going way, way back, if you didn't look somebody in the eyes, it was taken as being that you were shifty, that you were lying, that you were being insincere, dishonest in some way. So it was something that was really undesirable. I don't think it's as stigmatized now, but it certainly has been. And some of the ways to kind of work around that used to be taught to individuals still is to not necessarily look at a person's eyes, but to kind of look at their forehead, right? So it still gives the impression that you're looking them in the eyes, but you're really not. And it's kind of interesting because I actually did this when I first started teaching way, way back. It wasn't the most uncomfortable thing in the world, but you can imagine I was okay with speaking in public. But if you're sitting in a class full of 100 students, sometimes what happens is that when you're teaching, you just kind of lock in somebody's eyes, you start looking at a student, and you get distracted really easy. So what I did early on, I don't do this anymore, is I kind of like look above like the heads, like the hair area. And for whatever reason, it was just easier for me to focus. And I'm sharing that not because it's a weird story about your professor, but because that's kind of the same track of what many people do with ASD, right? If they look you in the eyes, it can be intimidating, it can be distracting for them, they can be too hypersensitive or hyper focused on it. So oftentimes they kind of learn that little trick or it's taught to them as a way of just overcoming it. One of the features when we talk about nonverbal communication that's kind of interesting, I think oftentimes is overlooked by a lot of people when we talk about ASD are the elements you see on this slide. So things like volume, prosody, and rate of speech. And remember with this, even though we're talking about nonverbal communication, this is involving speaking, right? So it's not necessarily fully nonverbal, but it's not the words you're saying, it's really how you're saying it. So volume, sometimes like I mentioned previously, it's speaking too loud for the situation or speaking too softly for the situation. So it's very context dependent and relationship dependent. Sometimes if you are speaking in a more formal professional setting, you're probably going to talk a little bit louder and with a certain tone in your voice than if you're in a private setting. Say, out having a picnic with your friend or something like that, or girlfriend, boyfriend. Prosody is the melody or rhythm of speech, and oftentimes it conveys emotion or it conveys nuance of meaning. So a good example of prosody, oftentimes I think of it as sort of like the sing-songy qualities of speech. In English, especially in the United States, if you have a question to ask somebody, oftentimes towards the end of the sentence, our pitch will actually kind of rise a little bit, right? So this is how we know the difference between something like, you know, how did you do on the last exam? Right? How did you do on the last exam? Like oftentimes we kind of don't even realize it. Start paying attention to it. You'll notice you do it. But this is one area where sometimes individuals with ASD haven't really picked up on that nuance. So oftentimes they'll just kind of deliver things in a very flat way. The next part on here is the rate of speech, and I've personally seen this quite a bit with some individuals with ASD, where they speak very, very quickly or they speak very slowly. Um, Oftentimes, I've noticed this is not anything technical or research driven, just my observations is that oftentimes people who talk faster, it seems that it's more of a reflection of them being uncomfortable with like social situations. So they may have scripted what they wanted to say and they're just trying to get it out really quick. Individuals who speak slowly, oftentimes it may just be because they're really super distracted. So that may be more of a reflection of things like they're being hyper focused on some kind of interest or something like that, or something that they'd rather do than something they don't want to do. So they may just start talking kind of slow because their mind's in a different place. Again, that's not anything technical or research driven. That's just my observation. All right, so facial expressions and gestures. I would say this is also one of those areas that sometimes is kind of overlooked when we talk about some of the nonverbal communication features of ASD. So, especially facial expressions, at least in my experience. Oftentimes, and maybe this is personal experience, because I've been told I'm a guy who kind of shows his emotions very clearly, right? It's hard for me to hide stuff. Oftentimes, though, individuals with ASD, some individuals with ASD, uh, really don't convey those emotions at all. It's like poker face 24/7. We call that a flat effect sometimes, right? So the best example of that is somebody who's really, really going through a traumatic or emotional experience. It may just talk so matter of factly, like in news anchor reading a news report at night, right? So uh, when I was 5, my mother died in a car crash. It was really sad, right? You're just like nothing. A lot of times people have full flat effect. You see it in things like major depressive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, unrelated to ASD. But just give you an example, like full flat effect would be where they may not even be talking. They're just kind of staring off in the distance, what we used to call the 1,000-yard stare. But that's not as common with ASD. But the kind of emotionless facial expressions does tend to be quite common. Hand gestures, I haven't seen as much personally. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not super common, but understanding hand movements, hand gestures, and being able to pick it up sometimes can be kind of an issue with some individuals that have ASD. So, when we talk about some of the implications and strategies here with aspects of nonverbal communication with individuals with ASD, one of the first things I want to talk about is to not use what we call deficit based language. So, not saying something like impaired eye contact. Say maybe the child's uncomfortable with eye contact, right? And the reason why I'm pointing this out is it kind of goes back to what I talked about with that empathy, the dual empathy model, which is that just because somebody's doing something different from what you're used to, even maybe what that culture or society is used to, doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. There may be components of this that could be quote unquote dysfunctional, but oftentimes what happens is your perception and response to their behaviors is what really becomes problematic, and vice versa. Now, in keeping with that, I think really one of the biggest things as a strategy is being aware. So whether, since you're clinicians, educators, peers, at some point in your life, whether it's a family member, a friend, a colleague, you name it, maybe yourself, you are going to be interacting with individuals who are neurodivergent, who are neuroatypical. If you are somebody who's neurodivergent or neuroatypical, you already know you're living in a world of neurotypical people and it can be difficult. So I think sometimes one of the biggest strategies here is just to be aware of that. Don't jump to conclusions. If somebody is standing too close to you, don't assume they're a weirdo. If somebody's avoiding eye contact, it's not because they're being distrustful or lying to you or anything like that. There could be other reasons. So always keep that in the back of your mind. It's difficult. You're going to want to jump to conclusions. That's kind of human nature, but don't, or at least consider some of these other options before you go on jumping to conclusions. Um, I think in doing that, it does open up more of a dialogue also of that mutual understanding. So maybe if I have a colleague and he's always speaking loud and he stands really close to me, you know, maybe me understanding, hey, this isn't this guy being weird or odd or annoying. Maybe he has autism. Maybe I just talk to the guy and say, hey, I've noticed you kind of do this sometimes. And when you do, the way I take it is like this. Is that the way you're intending it? Right? It opens that conversation and it does it in a non challenging, threatening way, which is quite different from the way most people handle those situations, which is to let it build up, build up, build up, and they start making little comments and it becomes a fight. Right? That's not a good way. That's a great way to start a fight. It's a great way to create conflict. It's not a great way to understand the other person. So that's my big takeaway from that section, especially when it comes to nonverbal communication. Moving on, we're going to start talking about relationships, social interactions. So this could be friendships. It could also be romantic relationships. We're not going to go into crazy amount of detail here. It's going to be more general information for all of those types of social settings. So one kind of general foundational thing to keep in mind, and this comes straight from this text, is an understanding of what we call social motivation and social energy. So social motivation is the desire to connect with others. Social energy is the capacity to engage socially with somebody without burning out. Now, this is not unique to ASD. Many of you are familiar with personality traits, and probably one of the biggest personality traits is the introversion extroversion. So that's true of individuals with ASD and individuals without ASD, right? There's introverts and there's extroverts. Introverts and extroverts may have social motivation, but introverts will often expend social energy being in groups, whereas extroverts will become energized. In fact, that's the big difference. Sometimes people say, oh, an introvert is shy and an extrovert is outgoing and outlandish. Well, it's not the case. Really, the definition is if I'm having like a burned out day, right? And my way of energizing myself is to be around people, to go call up somebody's, go see a movie, maybe go grab dinner after that. And at the end of that day, man, I feel better. I feel great. I feel really recharged. Right? I'm probably an extrovert. If I'm somebody that's like, oh my God, after a bad day, I don't want to see anybody. I want to like take a bath, take a shower, sit down, have some dinner by myself, and just relax. You're probably more of an introvert. Now, this is important to know, even though that's not just ASD, right? That's just personality in general. It kind of lends itself to this understanding of the unique way in which individuals with ASD experience social settings. Oftentimes, it's a misconception that people with ASD don't want friends, they don't want to socialize, and that's not true. I would say it's mostly a basic human nature. We're human, we're social animals. Humans are social animals. All of us, to one extent or another, some more than others, have that social motivation. The thing with individuals with ASD is that oftentimes they have a high level of social motivation, but low levels of social energy. So being in public oftentimes is extremely taxing to them. And some of it we already talked about, right? That push to try to fit in, that constantly trying to think, well, am I seeing this the same way? Are they going to misunderstand this? That can be exhausting. So it makes sense that oftentimes it's a very common feature of ASD and social settings, that it's very taxing for them. It's very draining for them. So important for you to know. Now, remember, again, those aren't necessarily terms just with ASD, but it helps you better understand how they interact in those social settings and what they're experiencing. Another important term for you to know is social flexibility. So social flexibility refers to adapting behaviors across different contexts. In many ways, I like to think of it as adapting to the situation that you find yourself in. So oftentimes the way I like to explain this is, the way I present myself as a professor to college students isn't the way I act in other settings. I don't act the same way, speak the same way, maybe even have the same tone of voice that I do when I'm giving a lecture as I do when I'm hanging out with my friends, as I do when I'm with my family, as I do when I'm with my son, right? I kind of put on different masks. All of us do. Um, that degree, though, to that flexibility, depending on the context, And not just of those settings, right? Those are different settings and different people, but also within the same setting, right? Of maybe having a friendly conversation with a friend that then they take the wrong way and it ends up kind of becoming more confrontational. That involves a lot of flexibility in being able to adapt to those situations. This is really a key part of being in any kind of social relationship, whether it's friendship, it's work relationships, it's romantic relationships. And oftentimes it is something that can be very, very difficult for those with ASD to handle, to manage, right? It tends to be a very big challenge for them. And oftentimes it can lead to a lot of misunderstandings. And that social energy we're talking about, that'll really drain it fast from somebody who has ASD. Some of that's a reflection of just the difficulties and nuances involved in relationships. Some of it also is that some individuals with ASD really don't like change as much. They kind of are more rigid and inflexible in their thought patterns. So having to adapt, from situation to situation and within situations can be really challenging. And I do really want to drive this home that it is a big misconception that uh, the average public has, and it's been a persistent one, that individuals with ASD don't want friends, that they're antisocial in the sense of them being shy or isolationist in their tendencies. And that's really not the case. Are there some who are like that? I'm sure, just like there's people who don't have ASD who are like that. But I would say it's not true of the vast majority. Oftentimes, when we talk about social relationships and that flexibility, we're also talking about management, right? So, how do you maintain the relationship? And oftentimes, when it comes to that, it becomes difficult. It's a lot harder to maintain a friendship than to become friends with somebody. And I'd say this is a soapbox moment for me, everybody. But, in our modern society, I think in the United States, oftentimes we look more towards quantity than quality. And I think a lot of that's a byproduct of social media, right? If I can log into whatever social media outlet I have and, oh, I got X amount of followers, X amount of friends, you know, that's kind of what people focus on rather than the quality of those relationships. And it's worth noting that, building, maintaining, and understanding relationships takes time, it takes effort, it takes a ton of energy, and it is very multifaceted. It's not just transactional, which again, I think is kind of a thing that we have in our society now is that we look at relationships as being transactional. What are you going to do for me? This is a problem in society as a whole, but when it comes to individuals with ASD, these complexities can be a really huge challenge. And that's really one of the ongoing things, especially with adults with ASD, is trying to navigate these relationships and to really focus on how to maintain them over time. So this concept of relationship management is really important. It can be defined as the process of understanding, building, and sustaining connections. Um, and again, it can be across many different things, right? If you're married, I'm married, me and my wife, we have to put a lot of time and effort into not taking our marriage for granted, not taking the other person for granted. Friendships, work relationships, even just regular like acquaintances, really takes this relationship management. It takes effort. It takes a willingness to actually kind of maintain that relationship in some way. Effective relation management supports a sense of belonging, and this is true on multiple different fronts, leads to better mental health and actually physical health also. In fact, when it comes to longevity studies and it comes to health effects of long term stress, they have found time and time again individuals with close knit social structures do a lot better. They're far more resilient than individuals who don't. And that's true across all aspects, right? ASD, non ASD, you name it. So some key elements of relationship management are things like having a shared interest, mutual experiences. These are things that kind of come as common sense, but it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of energy and dedication to actually really do it right. It's also worth noting that this is one area where it's not just dependent on context, like I talked about, like work friends versus like romantic relationships, but also context in terms of the life stage a person is in. Really when we first start forming friendships in toddlerhood, the type of interactions that we're doing is quite different from adulthood. In toddlers, we engage in what's called parallel play. So oftentimes it's sort of like you're playing and you may be with somebody else who's playing. You're not really playing together. You're not interacting. You're just both kind of doing your own thing. You're aware of the other person. That's kind of the extent of it. Once we start getting into early childhood, we start to go to school. We start to be in social situations more. We start to having to be forced to be around other children our own age that aren't in our families, that are oftentimes strangers when we first meet them. So this is where we start to develop friendships. This is where we start to develop group dynamics. And of course, once adolescence hits, that's when those group dynamics are like in charge. They are large and in charge, right? And this is also where we start to add the added element of romantic relationships. So not just friendships, not just family relationships, but dating, sexual interests, which are far more complex, in my opinion and in my experience, than regular friendships are. And of course, once we start getting into adulthood, that's where we deal with long term partnerships and involving social circles. In particular, where we start to have to deal with differing demands. So oftentimes this is where you have the conflict of managing a marriage or a long-term romantic partnership, maybe along with managing family relationships, maybe even starting a family at that point, being a parent yourself, versus work relationships versus friendships. And sometimes that can be a really difficult thing to manage for the best of us, right? And if you have any kind of impairments with uh, maintaining social relationships, it can be even more difficult. So let's connect this back to ASD. So, specifically with what I just talked about, individuals with ASD, some individuals with ASD, and I'd say most, uh, do generally have problems with making new friends independently. So sometimes what happens is, depending on programs and different types of interventions, if there's a structured process in place, a lot of people with ASD won't have a problem meeting friends, but that's not being done independently, right? That's being done where it's more structured. What I mean by independently is you left to your own devices, meeting with somebody, saying, that seems like a cool guy, seems like a cool girl. Like, I want to be friends with them. I want to date this person. And these look attractive to me, right? And then proceeding on their own. That's what I mean by independently. That can be quite challenging with people that have ASD. A lot of people have ASD. In addition to that, even if they do, so say they are in a more structured type of setting or something like that, it can be quite difficult for them to maintain those relationships long term. And again, it's really worth pointing out that's not a reflection of lack of empathy, interest, sympathy. It's not narcissism. It really is a reflection of just those difficulties with socialization in general. So I always want to make sure I point that out. And another big part of it is just the misreading of social signals, right? Just talked about a lot of the nonverbal cues that are difficult for individuals with ASD. We'll talk about other aspects as we go through this lecture. You put all those together, it makes it a lot more difficult to be in a long-term relationship because it increases the chances of misunderstandings, not being able to respond to those misunderstandings in an appropriate way, all sorts of potential minefield of problems that could really present themselves. The other part here is kind of the effects of what we talked about with the camouflaging or masking. When you think about it, I mean, in some ways, I think all of us do this when it comes to dating, right? You kind of put your best foot forward. You try to present yourself as being, a version of yourself. And then the more you get to know the person, the more you kind of become and let your guard down and just kind of become who you are. Well, a lot of times individuals with ASD, that masking feels has to always be there. So it can really bring out a lot of anxiety of like, is this person really friends with me or not? Like, do they even know who I am or do they know the version of me that I'm trying to present? Think about how difficult that's got to be. Right? So all of those things come together to really make it difficult to find friends independently or find relationships independently and to maintain those relationships. Now, there is a bit of a difference here as far as how that manifests by gender. So girls oftentimes do show higher social motivation and may engage in more nuanced pretend play. This is especially true of children, right? The pretend play is children, not adults, or not teens. Also, often, even girls who have ASD that are impacted show differences in the friendship quality and conflict handling. There's kind of a going theory that's been around for quite a while that when it comes to conflict resolution and like communicating, that females are often much better at this than our males. Now, I do want to put a caveat to that, though. That doesn't necessarily mean like men are incapable of having friends. And it doesn't mean that men can't communicate. I mean, I'm a man who's a therapist who works in psychology. I think if I had difficulty communicating, I probably wouldn't be in that profession. Um, these are general statements, these are theories. So you can kind of take it as you please. But they have noticed in kind of doing some of this research that there does seem to be a bit of a difference between just how these friendships occur and how that conflict resolution and communication styles are different between males and females. And when it comes to that conflict management, um, it's worth noting, right, in any relationship, conflict is going to come up. So being able to know how to handle it appropriately in a very mutually beneficial way is kind of imperative. The problem comes in though is that oftentimes, and I'd say this is more common with individuals who have ASD, but it's also very common just in society as a whole. So where that difference kind of lies, I'm not sure of, but oftentimes the way we handle it isn't in this mutually beneficial, you know, have a heart to heart, just talk about your feelings kind of way, but it's in more maladaptive ways, right? So you see here it says common approaches of conflict management. These are really maladaptive ways of handling conflict. And there's really three here that are listed. The my way or the highway, quotes, my way of saying it, which are really ways of controlling interactions, right? Like you did something I don't like, you need to change it, you need to do it this way, or we're not friends anymore. Right? That's more of that type of tactic. The going along to get along, or what we call passivity or internalized stress. This is oftentimes I have seen as being more common with individuals with ASD, or these second two, mind you. Right? So go along to get along oftentimes involves masking, it involves camouflaging. And it's just, I don't like this, I don't feel comfortable with this, but I need friends, I guess, right? So this person's going to be friendly as long as I do what they want me to do. And truthfully, a lot of times what I've seen is that, this first one and the second one kind of go hand in hand, sadly, especially with children that are kind of susceptible to bullying, right? And you can kind of see how that fits. The third way is something I think is actually quite common now. It's common with ASD, for sure, is just withdrawing from the situation altogether. What's the common expression now is ghosting. I think ghosting tends to be really common, especially with ASD, because sometimes just that idea of the conflict of, everything that the person has to expend energy wise that has ASD in a relationship is just overwhelming. So sometimes the best way of dealing with that for them in that moment is to just walk away, ignore it, just shut down. Now, is that unique to just ASD? No. I'm not saying everybody who does it has ASD. But does it tend to be very common? Yes. But then again, it's also common in society as a whole too. So take that as you will. I've not really seen anybody other than younger children that have ASD that really fall into this controlling interactions way of handling conflict, mind you. All right, we are rolling right along. I know this is going to be kind of a longer lecture. I did warn y'all, but not too much longer to go. So the next section is going to deal with repetitive or idiosyncratic behavior in individuals with ASD. So what are repetitive behaviors, at least when it comes to ASD? What are we talking about? When we talk about it in the context of ASD, we're really talking about any behavior that is either repetitive or idiosyncratic in nature. So repetitive, I'm going to leave that to itself. I think most of us can kind of understand the repetitive part. Idiosyncratic is, for lack of a better way of saying it, something that's kind of bizarre, odd, different, outside of cultural norms. And there's a variety of different ways in which that can be further broken down. Some examples of what we're talking about, these tend to be very common examples. And again, not everybody necessarily has all of these, right? So it's not like everybody with ASD experiences every one of these, or that they experience them consistently. They just tend to be very common in some people with ASD. So rocking, flapping, especially like hand flapping, movement, things like that. Skin picking, scratching. So oftentimes this isn't scratching like to hurt themselves, but just, scratching like this on an arm. Rubbing tends to be very common, especially certain body parts like the earlobes, tapping the fingers, rubbing the fingers, things like that. And then finally, repetitive speech patterns. Now, collectively, we kind of refer to all of these as being stimming behaviors. So that's short for self stimulating behavior. So it really kind of is connected in many ways, especially the nonverbal things that I just mentioned to the sensory component of ASD and what we kind of consider to be sort of the sensory etiology or causes of ASD. It's worth noting, mind you, that a lot of people, I say most people, even those without ASD, engage in these types of behaviors. And, I do it all the time. I'll sit there and I have my beard and I may stroke my beard. I rock quite a bit sometimes. Even the flapping, there's times where I do stuff like that if I'm really emphatic and I'm really into something or being really frustrated. Uh, It's worth noting, right, what we mean by the repetitive or idiosyncratic is kind of above and beyond, right? So why I may sit here and stroke my beard from time to time if I'm thinking or if I'm kind of bored. If I was doing this all day, every day, depending on, doesn't matter the context, it doesn't matter the situation, doesn't matter if it's necessarily appropriate or not, that's where then it kind of crosses that line. So I always like to point that out and make sure people are aware of it because otherwise people start looking at it as, well, I do that. Does that mean I have ASD? No. Or chances are no. But, taken to that level, these do tend to be very common. So many of the components when it comes to repetitive behaviors are kind of self-explanatory, right? I don't really have to go into detail about flapping or rocking or anything like that. But I did want to go into greater detail about the repetitive nature of speech or language with some individuals that have ASD. And again, this isn't everybody, but it does involve a little bit more nuance. So these speech or language behaviors can be either idiosyncratic or repetitive, right? So kind of repeating things over and over again in an appropriate way, or idiosyncratic in that they're just kind of bizarre, odd, not typical for the culture that you come from, or the language in this case, because we're talking about speech patterns, language patterns that you're speaking. So, a couple different examples of this. One is pronoun reversal. Now, I've heard about this with many people with ASD. I have to be honest, I've never really seen this, but it's where they may use pronouns in kind of an inappropriate way. And I know what you're probably thinking is like not the they, them, or wrongly gendering somebody with a pronoun. This is different. So it's where they may say like we when they really mean I a lot. They may use really formal pronouns that really aren't part of English anymore, other than like the Bible. So thee, thou, thy, right? And you just think about it, that's the idiosyncratic part. If you bumped into somebody on the street and they said, "Is thou happy today?" You'd probably think, "What? Like, is thou happy?" Or that seems very bizarre and kind of weird. Um, that's an example of what we're talking about here. Another example, so overly formal language. Now, certainly from time to time, maybe you say mother instead of mom, but say the run of the mill, most people say mom, mommy, mama, some variation thereof. Um, Oftentimes what you see is overly formal language is that it kind of permeates everything, right? So it's mother, it's father, it's teacher, and I'm always going to be using those terms. And it's enough to where it just sounds out of place from the way the average person, the typical person that's speaking that language would converse. Another one, and I would say this is probably, in my experience, the most common, is overuse of expressions. So things like sayings, like birds of a feather flock together, idiomatic expressions. So those are the things that idiomatic expression is those sayings that just kind of don't make sense. And if you think of it literally, it sounds awful. Like that's two birds with one stone. You really think about that literally, you're like, oh, that's awful, right? But we use those expressions a lot. That's perfectly fine, and that's just part of being a human being. It's part of English. But oftentimes, individuals with ASD may repeat that excessively, like a lot. Or quotes from movies. That's one I see quite a bit. Quotes from like anime, manga, K-pop, and they'll just use it over and over again. So the example I gave is like, live by the sword, die by the sword, or something like that, right? They may be talking to you and they're saying that same thing over and over and over again as they're talking. Like today I went to class and, I took my exam and I really wasn't prepared for the exam, but, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And then I was driving home and there's a lot of traffic. And, I kept thinking like these people that don't want to merge, you live by the sword, you die by the sword, right? And you kind of see where I'm going with that, right? So it's not literally just repeating it over and over again. They're telling stories, they're communicating, but they're kind of using that same saying over and over again. Repetitive vocalizations. So what I mean by repetitive vocalizations are things like humming is very common, repeatedly clearing your throat. You're not sick, it's not anything like that. It's just something that they do. Those tend to be very, very common. Two terms you need to know. So echolalia is something that we've talked about earlier in the semester. That's the repetition of sounds or words that are just heard. In many ways, early on in development, right, this is an important way to develop language because we're repeating the sounds we're hearing from our mom, our dad, our caregivers. But sometimes what happens is that individuals with ASD into childhood, adolescence, and adulthood may still kind of repeat what they hear around them in an inappropriate way. Polylalia is something that you have not heard, at least in this class before, and it's a repetition of your own words, sort of like echoing what you're saying repeatedly. That does tend to be quite common in some individuals with ASD. I have seen that before. I've seen echolalia and polylalia. So I wouldn't say those are necessarily super common, but they're also not very rare either. So it's worth noting when we talk about these repetitive behaviors that sometimes they can be viewed by an outsider, by somebody who's neurotypical, as the terms I mentioned, right? Bizarre, weird, odd. And they oftentimes treat the people who use them as odd, as weird, as outcasts. And of course, that perpetuates the problem. So, as I mentioned previously in this lecture, I think sometimes having an understanding is very helpful. And in this case, it's also an understanding of why they engage in these types of behaviors. So, even though they're oftentimes viewed as undesirable, and in the past, they frequently have been targeted for interventions, right? Usually early on in childhood, therapists would really focus on trying to get kids to stop doing these repetitive behaviors. They had really bad outcomes with that, mind you. And our view now is that these are actually kind of beneficial. The problem here isn't with the child or the adolescent or the adult doing it, it's with how society views them. So by you viewing these people as being odd, weird, whatever, it perpetuates the problem. And a lot of times, the reason why these individuals engage in these behaviors, sometimes it does feel like not necessarily voluntary on their part, but it does serve a purpose for them. In many cases, it can be used as a form of stress relief or to calm them down. Sometimes it can promote focus or limit the feeling of being overwhelmed. In some cases, it's just sort of like an emotional release. Sometimes it's even just to do things like fight boredom, have something to do. Oftentimes, what happens though, and this is why I said early interventions that really tried to get kids, especially, to stop these behaviors, led to worse problems because what happens is that oftentimes when you take them away or you prevent a child, especially from being able to use them, they will oftentimes have really strong emotional reactions to that. Coupled with that is the fact that they're feeling stigmatized, they're feeling isolated, they're feeling shame because they're picking up on the fact that they're doing something that you have a problem with. So again, this is an area where we're replacing judgment, uh, assumptions with knowledge and understanding. And if somebody's doing something like this, next time if you see it, maybe just even ask them. Just say, hey, I'm curious in a non-judgmental way. I see you doing this a lot. Would you feel comfortable enough to ask to tell me why you do it? And of course, also be respectful of whatever answer they give. But I think that's a really big area to start because oftentimes these are areas that a lot of people with ASD, especially young children and especially teens, have a tendency to have bad experiences with. So, in closing this section, I wanted to mention and provide a little bit of clarity because oftentimes when I talk about repetitive behaviors, I get a lot of students that ask questions about, well, isn't that really this or that? Right? So, some of the behaviors that are common with ASD, like these repetitive behaviors, are also common with other types of disorders or conditions. So, for example, things like tardive dyskinesia, which is usually causes a side effect from taking certain medications, can lead to muscle movements, twitches. Obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, sometimes has this kind of focus on repetitive behaviors. Tourette syndrome sometimes can have verbal issues that come up that are similar to ASD. And then another one is tic disorder, right? So this is an actual condition. It's in the DSM where a person engages in muscle movements that really are kind of not explained by anything else. So tardive dyskinesia is usually a side effect of certain medications. Tic disorder just happens organically. We don't really know what causes it. So to unpack this a little bit, because it's important for you all to know just generally, there's a way in which we kind of distinguish them, right? So sometimes people just look at them and they associate them together. They are different. So a tic is a sudden movement or vocalization that is repetitive but non-rhythmic. They can either be simple or complex. So like a simple tic can be where you just kind of have a twitch of your shoulder. A more complex one can be where it's several movements in one. And again, it can be a muscle movement, but it also can be vocalization. So the muscle movement part, we see that with tardive dyskinesia, which again, then would be caused by medication. So you'd ask the person if they're experiencing that, if they're taking these medications. They stop taking them and it goes away. They probably had tardive dyskinesia. If not, then it's probably tic disorder. Tourette syndrome would be the mostly vocalizations. Tics are not the same thing as stemming behaviors in ASD because they usually are smaller movements, usually not rhythmic or pattern, which is the case in ASD. So stemming behaviors are oftentimes rhythmic, they're oftentimes pattern, they're kind of continuous. They are usually also not described as relaxing, soothing, or enjoyable. Right? So if I have tardive dyskinesia or I have a tic disorder and I'm engaging in these tics, I'm probably not saying this is helping me calm down. But remember those benefits I said of those repetitive behaviors in individuals with ASD. It can help calm, soothe, provide focus, provide a distraction when they're feeling overwhelmed. So oftentimes the stemming behaviors are viewed as being more soothing and enjoyable. So that's a big distinction there too. Compulsions. So compulsions are actions fueled by anxiety over unwanted or intrusive thoughts. Obsessive compulsive disorder is where a person experiences obsessions, which is the thought patterns that propel kind of these compulsions, right? So that's a good way of looking at OCD. So the example given here is a fear of germs, which is what the obsession would be in somebody with OCD, or some people with OCD, if they have that specific one, would lead to the compulsion then of excessive hand washing. The idea is that the obsession, the fear of germs, is so strong and is causing so much anxiety that the only way for me to really release that is to wash my hands, right? So that's the compulsion part. Now, individuals with ASD don't engage in repetitive behaviors due to anxiety necessarily, right? I mean, that could be some, we said stress and calm down, but it could also be a lot of other things. It could just be boredom. It could be, you name it. Not engaging in the behavior, though, with somebody with OCD usually does lead to more anxiety. Whereas in those with OCD, they have to engage in the behavior or they'll be so overwhelmed by the anxiety. So that's kind of the difference. It's a very nuanced difference, but it's one that is kind of worth noting. Now, ASD and OCD are strongly comorbid, so it's not uncommon for somebody to have both. But that being said, my little soapbox moment here, y'all, is that oftentimes OCD is often diagnosed incorrectly in people with autism spectrum disorder also. And there is some literature that kind of supports that also. And we are moving right along. We are in the home stretch, folks. Only about another 12 more slides to go. The next section we're going to talk about is flexibility, or really what would probably be more appropriately called inflexibility or rigidity in individuals with ASD. So this is an area where I'm going to sound like a broken record. I'm talking about stuff I've mentioned earlier, in fact, fairly recently. So although it is often a stereotypical behavior for those with ASD to be overly rigid, this is often inaccurate. Not always, but it's often inaccurate. It's kind of a stereotype. Many people with autism spectrum disorder can exhibit a tremendous amount of flexibility in some areas, but rigidity in other areas. So we're talking about flexibility and rigidity. What we're talking about isn't like movements. It's more like cognitive flexibility, right? Your ability to adapt and change, to accept change. So keep in mind, it's not an all-encompassing, what we call global aspect, right? So it's not like individuals with ASD are completely inflexible and rigid in their thinking on all things all the time. It's helpful to develop this concept that's called islands of rigidity. So what that means is an adherence to inflexibility in specific domains. So not in all things they do, but in certain areas, they tend to be some people with ASD tend to be very inflexible and kind of rigid in their thinking. Now, I said this is going to sound like a broken record. This is also an area that kind of ASD has in common with OCD, with obsessive compulsive disorder, because some people with obsessive compulsive disorder also have that inflexibility. Now, in this regard, it's not as clear cut, right? So oftentimes what you really have to do is look at the context, look at the specific domains between the two. And again, even though sometimes there's some debate and it may be overly diagnosed, it is a very common co-occurring disorder for a person to have OCD and ASD. So when I was talking about the islands of rigidity, I wanted to give you some examples of what we're really talking about here, because these are the specific domains. And oftentimes what you see is that many individuals with ASD will have a lot of rigidity, but just in one of these domains, or maybe a few, like one or two or three of them, but not in all of them. So these are some of the most common domains or topics where that inflexibility or rigidity tends to be more common in individuals with ASD. So the first one is things like routines and rituals, and this is where there's some similarity to OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Strong reactions to small changes, difficulty coping with transitions, something called autistic inertia. So important term for you to know. Autistic inertia refers to difficulty getting started on something or to stop doing something, right? So oftentimes what happens is it's sort of like once they get going, it's kind of like a rock in motion, right? It's just going to keep tumbling. The difference, though, in this case is that sometimes the rock in motion when what gets going is putting stuff off also, right? So it can actually be procrastination, or it can be so intensely focused and into something, that they don't stop when they probably should stop. Sounds kind of contradictory, but it makes sense when you really kind of think about Polarized thinking, so black and white thinking tends to be very common. It's either this or it's that. There's no gray, there's nothing in between. Overgeneralizing is kind of a side effect of that also, that, if this happens and this happens and this happens, then it means, the worst thing possible. Sometimes that can be an example of like catastrophizing. One area, though, that I say is very, very, very common with many people with ASD is what I have listed here as a unusually strong moral compass or rule following. All of us kind of should follow rules. We should have a moral compass. And is this necessarily a bad thing? No. But I have seen where some people with ASD, it is like very, very strict. They will not go 1 mile over the speed limit. They will never cross a street unless it's at a crosswalk and, it says you can walk. They're never going to, like it goes on and on, right? Where it's almost like, wow, like I didn't know those people existed. Like people that strict with this, people that strict with this. And it tends to be very common in my experience with a lot of people with ASD. The other one that's very common is literal interpretations. That is very, very common, right? So you walk into somebody's office, they say, take a seat. And they pick up the seat and they say, where do you want me to take it? You're like, no, I meant sit down. Well, why don't you just say sit down? Very, very common. The next one on here tends to be very common, but in my experience, it's usually with children more than adolescents and adults, and that's attachment to objects. Those objects can be things like, a teddy bear, a doll, a blanket, things like that, but they tend to be very, very attached to it. Now, in some ways, this is part of development, right? It is very typical for children, especially young children, toddlers, to have their favorite doll or blanket or whatever. But usually, this level of attachment is kind of the next level of it, beyond what would be considered typical. All right, folks, moving right along. I swear we're in the home stretch here. Second to the last chapter I'm going to be talking about. So, intense or atypical interests in individuals with autism spectrum disorder. So, this is actually a key component of the features of autism when it comes to the diagnostic criteria. So, the DSM definition when it comes to intense or atypical interests are highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. So there's some terms here to unpack. The first one is restricted. So that's a difficult term to kind of define. And indeed, a lot of times it's sort of a subjective interpretation. So what I mean by that is usually restricted is something where it's like a very focused, kind of unwavering level of attention. But oftentimes, the best way that we kind of define it is as being all encompassing, or some kind of interest that limits a person from experiencing other types of thoughts or experiences. There's a couple other terms to unpack from this. So the next one is fixated, and it refers to an interest that is abnormal in frequency and or intensity. So it may be kind of typical or fine for, say, somebody who's a teenager to be interested in video games. Maybe play video games all the time, maybe every day. But would it be considered typical for a person to play video games every day for a week to the point that they're not getting sleep, to the point that they're not showering, they're not going to school, they're not doing anything that would be considered normal kind of upkeep in their life? Well, probably not. I would say that's kind of like maybe a little bit too much. Now, this kind of goes hand in hand, but remember, it's an either or, right? So it's either fixated as far as abnormal in intensity or focus. And the term abnormal is kind of a pejorative. It's kind of a bad word, right? Because that implies that there's a normal, and there really isn't a normal in most of these things. So oftentimes what we see is more of a focus, and in the DSM, they're trying to do this. Change abnormal to atypical, or non-normative is another way of saying it. So all of these are kind of frequently based on a subjective societal standard. And that's an important thing to know, right? And that's kind of a key feature of a lot of things in the DSM, is you have to base it on some kind of cultural norm or a typical standard. Is it the perfect way? Is it the best way? Maybe not, but I don't know a better solution. As we kind of have to have that societal standard. And it's important because, as we noted with many things with ASD, the fact that you don't necessarily fit in, the fact that you are not typical within that society, leads to a lot of problems. Is that society's issue? Should society be better with it? Yeah. But it also opens the door that they need additional help, they need additional guidance as a result of that. So the types of interests that people with ASD have, the sky's the limit, right? It's not like there's only certain categories. But I do have some of the most common interests that tend to come up quite a bit. So those include animals, reading, various topics in human behavior. Oftentimes you kind of see where some people with ASD may actually be fixated on that as sort of like doing research into how to STEM, into how to mask better. Generally, STEM topics do really well. So what I mean by STEM is science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And indeed, a lot of times you see where, especially with me, college students, maybe really focus on things like health sciences in particular, because it kind of combines a lot of that STEM topics into one field. Plants, gardening, and nature tend to be very common. Believe it or not, a lot of the fixated interest people with ASD do have is autism itself. It's reading up on the disorder, kind of delving into that community more. Languages. So this is one area that I have noticed a lot. And it's kind of interesting because I don't have I'm sorry, I can't talk. I don't have autism spectrum disorder. I do like languages, and this is going to be an example I'm going to give of what would be the difference between, say, a typical interest in language versus an atypical interest in language. That kind of goes into that aspect of being repetitive. So I like languages. I like foreign languages. I love English. I have learned a few foreign languages over time. It's kind of like a little hobby. It's a way for me to just kind of pass the time, de-stress after a long day. Uh, I do it where I can, and I maintain those languages where I can. I speak Spanish and Portuguese, by the way, in addition to English, right? And those are two languages that I had to learn over 10 plus years. Somewhat typical, right? Now, I would say even that's not that typical of somebody in the United States because most of us are monolingual, but that's beside the point. An atypical demonstration, what would be kind of common with somebody with ASD, is they'd be able to tell you all components of language. So, for example, they'd be able to tell you the difference in English between the subjunctive text versus the, progressive text of English. They are able to tell you the history of the evolution of French, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, Arabic. They speak all those languages fluently. They learn languages like Arabic within 6 months because they devote their entire attention and focus to that over those 6 months, doing nothing but that. Right? So you can kind of see we're like, wow, that's cool. Like that's impressive. I wouldn't necessarily say it's like the worst thing in the world. I mean, it could be a benefit to it, but you can kind of see where it's a little bit more excessive and kind of to that next level. In addition to that, music, arts, crafts, research, maps, geography all tend to be pretty common. I kind of laugh though somewhat because, everybody kind of has an interest, I would say, in something on this list to some extent. I have several. But again, remember the example I just gave of languages, right? So it's not just an interest in it. It's not just a really big interest in it. It's kind of that next level. So I do feel like this is one area where I may be beating the horse to death, but I'm doing it for good reason because this is one of those areas in the past I have kind of learned from talking to students that, tends to be a little bit a focus of their attention that, well, I do that. Like I have played video games for a week straight, So I like to kind of unpack this a little bit and really give the difference between kind of like a quote unquote typical level of interest versus what would be commonly seen in somebody with ASD that has this more clinical level of interest in something, right? So remember that involvement with interest isn't unique to ASD. but rather part of just the human experience as a whole. The manner in which these interests are experienced is what distinguishes it with some individuals that have autism spectrum disorder. So, a couple components here, right? The level of intensity is oftentimes much greater in somebody with ASD than it is with somebody who isn't. The depth and breadth it demands, right? The difference between maybe learning a foreign language in your free time when you're able to because it's fun and interesting and you want to learn that language versus I will learn this in 6 months by devoting all my attention during the 6 months to it. The inability to disengage, that tends to be really, really, really common with individuals with ASD. Part of it is kind of that inertia that I talked about, the autistic inertia, that once they get started on something, sometimes it's difficult to break off from it. Some of it is just an element of that overfixation too. The effect on a person's life. So, if I'm able to play video games and I'm doing that in my free time, but I'm still able to shower, work, have friendships, pay the bills, well, that's not really an impact on my life. I have my right to do what I want in my free time. That's quite different from somebody who maybe is doing those activities at the expense of those day-to-day necessities. The other one is just this kind of all-encompassing, all-or-nothing mentality. Like either I'm playing this or like I'm done. I don't want to do anything. Right? Either I'm playing with my Legos or that's the end of the world. Just I want to kill myself. Right? And I say that sounds like a really extreme example. I have seen people that are actually at that level. All right, so I have been teasing that we're in the home stretch. This is officially it, folks. This is the last chapter I'm going to be covering. So the light is at the end of the tunnel. So in many ways, I think I saved the best for last because this last chapter we're going to be covering deals with sensory differences as a feature of autism spectrum disorder. This is kind of included in the DSM definition, but it's worth noting that not everybody necessarily with ASD has like a clinical way of featuring a sensory difficulty. It's kind of a difficult concept because a lot of theories now and a lot of research is pointing to sensory difficulties or challenges as perhaps being a core component of ASD, right? So if it's difficult for me to process visual cues or hearing, then that's probably going to impact my ability to develop language, which is a key feature for ASD, or social interactions, which is a key feature of ASD. So in many ways, the sensory problems we kind of look at more as being ideological in nature. But that being said, many people with ASD throughout their life do still experience sensory concerns. And in fact, many people refer to autism spectrum disorder as a sensory disorder. So the DSM definition is hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So while sensory issues are more common in those with ASD, they are not specific to ASD, and they cannot form the sole basis of a diagnosis. That's really important, right? It's not, even though people say sensory disorder, it is not only that. And indeed, some people have a very, very minimal influence by it as a whole. Some researchers and clinicians have favored the view that sensory differences in those with ASD lead to various symptoms of the disorder. They also explain this as a reason for the divergent nature of how ASD presents. Going all the way back to that constellation model of ASD, it's not just if something's present or isn't. So it's not just that I have hyposensitivity to visual stimuli, but maybe that then leads to me avoiding eye contact, which leads to social concerns. It avoids me looking at my caregiver, mom, dad's face as I'm growing up. So it's difficult for me to learn language properly, right? So it's kind of like how that impacts can lead to that divergent nature of the symptoms of ASD. All that being said, I do want to make sure it's kind of clear, and this is going to be something that's going to sound a little trippy, but it's very difficult sometimes to see how a person perceives senses. So I'll unpack that a little bit and I'll give you a personal example. So I have color blindness. I'm not totally colorblind, but I have red-green color blindness. Now, chances are the way I see color and perceive it is different not just from somebody who isn't colorblind, but even from other people who have the same red-green color blindness. But how would you know the difference? How would you know that the way you see blue is different from the way somebody else sees blue? You kind of can't. And I know that sounds really trippy, but that's one of the reasons why when we talk about sensory difficulties, some things are easier to research than others. Me having an inability to see red isn't that difficult because they can put something in red onto something that's green and like do it that way. But whether I see the actual other colors the same way, who knows? And in fact, in some ways, we all may have developed the ability to perceive, to sense the world around us in our own unique kind of different ways. That's like fun, it's interesting, it's kind of a mind trip, but knowing that, it's really difficult to do research on this. And that's the whole reason why I kind of took you down that little bunny trail for a little bit, folks. It's also worth noting that not all senses are equally affected by ASD. And again, this is another area where it depends on the person, it depends on the severity, it depends on a variety of different factors. I do want to make a point, though, of saying that oftentimes people view your sensory systems as really being the big five, which is hearing, touch, vision, taste, and smell. However, you have many more sensory systems that are oftentimes not well recognized or even really noticed by us. So these include things like interoception. Interoception refers to your ability to recognize like internal states and how you perceive it. Like me being hungry, me being gassy, me being in pain. Pain's a little bit different in this sense, though. It's more like internal pain. Your vestibular system. So your vestibular system is located in your ears, and it gives you that sense of balance. Proprioception. So proprioception, I talked about earlier in the lecture. It deals with sort of like body orientation, not balance, but like positioning, movement. Nociception. Nociception refers to pain. And in this sense, it's more like outside physical pain. Like if I touch a hot pan, it's going to burn the outside of my skin. That's my nociception on it. And then the final one on here is thermoception. Thermoception is your ability to sense temperature differences. Some people even go beyond these, but the reason why I'm going through these is some people may have more hyper or hypo awareness that have ASD with hearing or touch or vision or taste or smell. Some may have hearing and touch or some combination thereof. Very few, I have not met any, I'm sure, never say never, have all of these. I would say it's more common for ASD to affect the five here on the left, I guess right, the ones I'm circling right now, it depends on how you're looking at it, versus the interoception, vestibular, proprioception, although those two, and in fact, I talked about it earlier, how things like issues with proprioception can interfere with like even sitting down in a chair, that they can always kind of feel a little bit uncomfortable and weird and not really get their positioning right. Interoception, sometimes can be an explanation for things like food aversions, which tend to be really common with children that have ASD, where they may just be really more aware that if I eat certain foods, I feel this way or I feel that way. Some of that can also be an aspect of taste, of course, and smell, and texture. So it really is kind of multifaceted. So let's bring this together and kind of look more at how these sensory issues or challenges are actually manifested. So like I've done throughout this lecture, this is a list of some of the more common sensory impacts in individuals with ASD. It's not a comprehensive list, and it's not saying everybody with ASD has every one of these. They just tend to be some of the more common ones that are experienced. So aversions to specific sounds. That can be specific sounds, as in like the crumpling of paper. I know that tends to be kind of a common one. It can also be kind of a hypersensitivity or hyper awareness of sound. So, in what I would consider to be just a kind of moderately noisy room, they may view as being deafening. Discomfort with certain types of light. That can be natural light, it can be artificial light, it can be strobe lights, it can be black lights. It really just kind of depends on other different colors of lights. Discomfort with certain textures. This tends to be really common with kids. So things like socks, tags on clothes, like the backs of shirts and stuff like that, um, can be really difficult for them. It could also be different types of texture. So like silk versus cotton versus wool versus like, I don't know, denim. Aversions to human touch, types of touch. Now, this is one that's kind of interesting. You'd probably think if I said, do you think it's more common for children, some children with ASD that have this type of sensory challenge, to view light touch as being problematic or heavy touch, like grabbing? Believe it or not, it's more common light touch. A lot of times, it's not super rare. Some kids that have ASD will say like a light touch, like a feather, is like torture to them, that they cannot stand that. So again, not super rare, but not super common either. Kind of, it's out there. I have seen it. Aversions to specific smells tends to be very common. Sensory aspects of hygiene. So a lot of times that can be an aversion to things like the taste of toothpaste, the sensation of a wet, well, not wet beard, usually not with kids, wet hair, things like that. The sensation of soap or of the washcloth on the skin can be something that they can be really hypersensitive to. I talked about interoception. Well, hypersensitivity to internal sensations, like internal pain, like if I have pain from gas or indigestion or hunger, right? That can be something that is part of everyday experience, but especially for some kids that have this challenge, the sensory challenge with ASD, it can be really, really elevated for them. And that, coupled with taste and smell, kind of multiple of them coming together, can lead to some of these food restrictions, which are really, really common with kids with ASD. And that can be texture, like mushy things. No. It can be taste. It can be smell influence. And it can also be the interoception. So, for example, a lot of times kids that have this will be really against fruit and vegetables, not because they're bad or because they maybe don't even like them, but because they're high in fiber and it causes, gas or indigestion. It makes you feel like you got to poop, which is going to be really, really heightened in them. So they start to learn that they don't like fruit, they don't like vegetables, they don't like anything with fiber. And then the proprioception, I've talked about this earlier, but oftentimes that can lead to issues with like posture control, even being able to sit comfortably or in a way that they feel is like appropriate. Another interesting aspect of the sensory component of autism spectrum disorder is something called sensory craving. So this can be defined as an unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So this is you interacting with your environment more than like the passive things I was talking about before. And it usually leads to behaviors where the child, and it's usually children, kind of like engage in order to fulfill this craving. So some examples I have listed here is like close visual inspection of objects. And this could be where a kid would like really like examine stuff and they may even like squint their eyes and like really make a big production out of like visually examining food or material, like even things like dirt and stuff like that. Fascination with visual repetitive movement. This is really common, especially with really young kids, like toddlers, will they be fixated on like looking at a fan and just watch it move. Now, that's not super uncommon with kids in general, but again, remember, it's the extent at which that behavior goes on. So it's not just watching it for like 5-10 minutes, it's watching it for like an hour. Unusual sensory exploration. So that can be, a variety of different things. And you kind of see two of them listed, especially one, right? So an example of unusual sensory exploration can be things like frequently chewing or sucking on clothing. Um, you know, things like shirts tend to be really, really common. Hair tends to be really, really common. Sometimes it can be stuff that are like non-food items, like dirt, uh, toys, things like that. So that's one aspect of it. Another form of like unusual sensory exploration that I've seen before is like ripping of paper, where it's just something about that ripping of paper, and they'll just keep like ripping paper and ripping paper. It's the sensation of it, it's the sound of it, and they just kind of like crave that interaction. Also, and the last one listed on here is a strong affinity for textures or tactile experiences, tactile input of like rubbing objects, touching objects, feeling them. In some cases, this can be like uh, going back to objects as being a fixated interest, also. So things like teddy bears or something like that, especially the teddy bear has a certain texture to it. And again, these sensory cravings tend to be more common with children. They tend to be less common with adolescents and adults. And a lot of times, that's not necessarily that the craving subsides. It's really more that they just get better at masking because they realize that some of these just make them look atypical. So they want to fit in. So they develop masking behaviors to try to hide it. Congratulations, folks. You have made it to the end. This is the last slide. It wasn't too long of a lecture. I mean, it's 2 hours. That is kind of long. So my apologies there, but I did have to cover a lot of material. So the last thing I want to leave you with is kind of a unique component, and this isn't necessarily of ASD, but it's common in ASD. So there's two sensory conditions, if you will, that tend to be very common with ASD, and those are synesthesia and misophonia. So these are not a part of ASD. In fact, these two aren't even disorders. They're conditions. So they're not part of the DSM. But they tend to be overrepresented in individuals with ASD. So I'll start with synesthesia. So synesthesia is a condition that involves experiencing sensory interactions that cross over different modalities or sensory systems. So for example, hearing color or tasting shapes. Synesthesia isn't necessarily that rare, but it's not common either. It's about 2% of the US population. But some studies have suggested it's about 10 to 20% of individuals with ASD. Why? We don't really know. But again, remember, there's a lot of research going into the sensory disruptions as being kind of the key feature of the cause of ASD. So the idea is that maybe it's the same kind of disruption that can lead to like synesthesia. Now, that being said, plenty of people have synesthesia that don't have ASD and vice versa, but it's a higher amount of prevalence within the ASD community than the average population by a significant amount. That's almost 10% or 10 times if you go on the high end of that. Misophonia. So misophonia is different from synesthesia. It's a condition that involves intense emotional reactions to specific sounds. Misophonia occurs in roughly 5% of the US population, but is higher among those with ASD with a rate of 12 to 35%. So a little bit different in how this manifests, but again, what we're talking about is a sensory disruption. And that's a much higher percent. You're talking about twice to 7 times the rate of the average population. Now, it's worth noting neither of these conditions are well studied in themselves. So not only are they not well studied, but the connection between them and ASD is really not studied. And there's some difficulties with studying them. And this is a very complex thing. In fact, if you want to go down a rabbit hole online, look up synesthesia. It's a really interesting condition, and there's multiple different types of synesthesia that exist. Really interesting stuff. And this is an area that in ASD research is a growing field also, because again, there's a lot more emphasis on the sensory etiologies within ASD. So hopefully you found this to be an informative lecture. Thank you so much for listening to the entirety of it. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, I'm always available to help however I can. Take care.